St. Paul the Apostle, and this is new stuff that we're going to head into tonight. Like I said, I'm going to be kind of hop, skipping, and jumping over chapters 21 through 28. 28 is the last chapter in the book of Acts. So St. Paul is attacked and arrested in the Temple of Jerusalem. And this is about AD 57 when this takes place. Paul is recognized, seized, and attacked at the temple by unbelieving Jews. So he's at the temple, and he's got some men with him, and they're down there worshiping God at the temple in Jerusalem. And as I have here, at the temple, Jews from Asia recognize Paul. They form a mob, and they attack him. I mean, they're just beating on him. The Roman commander in Jerusalem, Claudius Lysias, hears of it, and he comes to the rescue, basically. He arrives. He has soldiers and centurions with him, and he stops the beating. He doesn't know what's going on, but he stops it. Paul addresses the commander in Greek. He speaks Greek to the commander, and the commander becomes interested. He goes, "You know Greek?" That's what he says. "You know Greek?" "Yes, I know Greek." And he tells him where he was from and his kind of his background and so forth. And this commander becomes interested in Paul. And as we go through this, you're going to see that he likes Paul. There's something about Paul that he likes very much, and he's going to protect him. Paul is allowed to speak to the Jews at the temple, which he does, and he speaks to them in Hebrew. Paul asks the commander, he says, "Would you mind if I speak to the group that was just beating me?" And he's, "Oh, go for it." And so he starts talking in Hebrew to this group. St. Paul presents his testimony at the temple complex. Paul speaks to the Jews of Jerusalem about his conversion experience and all the stuff that kind of went along with that. He talks about how remember, he's talking to Jews, and they're very passionate, obviously. And he talks about his heritage, and he talks about how he was educated under Gamaliel, which everybody knew. And Gamaliel was very, very respected. And he said, "That was the guy I studied under. And I was very zealous for Judaism." And he says, "Just like you guys are now, that's where I was. And I was such a zealous Jew that I persecuted the early church." So he's saying, I was doing all that. But then he describes his encounter with Jesus of Nazareth just outside of Damascus. And he tells them about that. He talks about encountering Christ and then going into the city. He was blind. He had to be led into the city. And he says that I went into the city, and there was a devout Jewish Christian there in Damascus. His name was Ananias, who spoke to me. And here's what he told me. Ananias told me that the God of our fathers has chosen you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true God, the creator. The God of our fathers has chosen you, Paul, that you should know his will. So Paul knows the will of God because God says you're going to know it. You're going to know it. So when you hear Paul preach and his message and the things that he teaches, we need to understand that that is coming from God. And God has chosen you to see the just one. I'm talking about Jesus here. Jesus appeared to Paul once outside the city of Damascus, but throughout Paul's ministry, it looks like, and we're going to see one tonight, where Jesus did that occasionally, or maybe often, I don't know, but he appeared to Paul more than one time. It seems like a number of times. So Paul saw the resurrected, glorified Jesus. And also, God has chosen you to hear the voice of his mouth, to actually hear him speaking. Because when Paul saw Jesus, he also heard Jesus. So he heard the voice of Christ, which is amazing. He got to do all that. We also were told in another place that Paul went up to the third heaven. Paul saw a lot of stuff. And this is why he becomes so passionate and so strong about his ministry, promoting Christ, no matter what happens to him, all the persecution. He kept promoting Christ. He was never ashamed to do that because he had seen so much. And so you and I, the readers of the book of Acts and kind of seeing what Paul's doing, we're to say, okay, this guy saw something that made him like this. And we may not see what he saw, but it's kind of reflecting off of Paul and his passion and his dedication to Christ. And that kind of comes to me and say, he saw something that made him like this and not afraid to die. And so we need to live for that thing he saw, even if we never see it. We're kind of seeing it through St. Paul. It's like the gloriousness of what's next is so amazing that you just give yourself to Christ, no matter what happens to you. And so Saul presents his testimony at the temple complex. Paul speaks of his return to Jerusalem. Now, he's still talking to this group. And he says, here's what happened, after I met Christ and all this. Then I eventually came back to Jerusalem, but I was converted to Christ when I came back. And he says, after I came back, I was in the temple one time and I fell into a trance and Jesus appeared to me right there at the temple. And Jesus told me to get out of Jerusalem. Why? And this is what Jesus said, because talking about the Jews in Jerusalem, they will not receive your testimony concerning me. They rejected me and they're going to reject the testimony of me as you speak of me. And so Jesus told him, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. Now, when he said that, the Jews to whom he was speaking to, they all began shouting in one accord for Paul's death. He needs to die for saying that. Up to that point, they're listening. But when he said that Jesus sent me away from you to the Gentiles, they had a fit over that. They were Jews. They were the chosen people. They called the Gentiles dogs. And Gentiles means the nations. So we're the Jews, and then there's the rest of the nations, right? All the other nations, they're dogs compared to us. So for him to say that Jesus led him away from the Jews to the dogs, they had a fit over that. And they were like, you need to die, you need to die. And they start shouting that. The Roman commander rescues Paul again and takes him into the Roman barracks. This is the Antonia fortress, which I have a picture of there on the right side. That's a picture of a model of it. But that was kind of the station that the Romans used when they were in Jerusalem. Tradition says that's where Jesus was before Pontius Pilate, at the Antonia fortress. So they take him in there to keep him safe. Also, they want to talk to him and they want to just kind of find out what's going on. St. Paul in the Roman military. The Romans discover that Paul is a Roman citizen and they treat him as such. The Romans intend to interrogate Paul by scourging. They called it interrogation under scourging. That means, okay, we want to know what's going on, and we're going to make you tell us exactly what's going on, because we're going to scourge you, then let you talk, and scourge you again if we don't feel like you're shooting straight with us. That's how we're going to get the truth out of them. It's like torture in a way, right? And so they're about to do that. And as this scourging and interrogation is about to begin, he turns to a centurion and he asks a question. He says, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman? And that means Roman citizen. And they all understood that. And uncondemned. Is that cool for you to do that? You're going to scourge a Roman citizen and I have not been condemned of anything? You're about to do that? Is that okay? Now, everything stops when he says that. And they go get the Roman commander, and the Roman commander comes back in, and he goes, are you a Roman citizen? And Paul says, yes. And he goes, how? And the Roman commander says to Paul, he goes, it was with a lot of money that I bought my citizenship. That's hard to get, Roman citizenship in the first century. And he goes, I had to spend a lot of money to buy that. How did you get yours? And Paul says, I was born a citizen. Again, that's like somebody saying for spring break, I'm going to Disney World. And then you say back, well, I'm traveling Europe. It's just like, oh yeah, okay. Wow. That's a little better. And so he was born a citizen. So at this, the Romans then greatly feared because they had bound an uncondemned Roman citizen. And the Romans were extremely rule of law. And so they knew that they could get in great trouble for having done this. They should have checked on that. They didn't think at all that this man who was being, attacked in the temple, a Jew, was a Roman citizen, but he is. And so they begin treating him like a Roman citizen. So St. Paul before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. The Romans allow the Sanhedrin to question Paul, and he brilliantly defends himself. All right, so he begins to talk, and he was talking about how Jesus appeared to him, God was speaking to him, and the high priest didn't like that. The high priest of Jerusalem, Ananias, did not like the way Paul was talking. He thought it was arrogant, and so he motioned to a guard to strike Paul on the mouth. The guard did it, and then Paul looked at the high priest and said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds like an insult to me. And then the guard says, is that the way you talk to the high priest? And then Paul says, oh, I didn't know it was the high priest. I find that very difficult to believe. And so then Paul knows, like, this is not a friendly audience. This could turn into some trouble for me. So he does this. He says to the Sanhedrin, he cries out, he says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee," which he is. "And I am the son of a Pharisee." It's a tradition in our family. We're solid Pharisees. And he says, "Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." He throws that out there. Now, at this, the Pharisees and Sadducees began to argue amongst themselves passionately because the Pharisees believed in a resurrection from the dead, in an afterlife. The Sadducees did not. They believed that this life was it. And they always argued about this. Paul knew that. And he says, "I'm just going to kind of turn this assembly into chaos because I feel like they're coming to get me. So I'm just going to throw some chaos out there." And he shouts that out. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees begin arguing over the matter. And even as you read the book of Acts, the Pharisees begin to defend Paul. "This man's not guilty. Why is he on trial? You Sadducees have him on trial." And they're going and going. And it gets crazy. And so the Roman commander, fearing Paul would be torn to pieces, takes him by force from the Sanhedrin and returns him to the barracks. So this Claudius Lysias keeps saving Paul's life, this Roman commander. St. Paul is visited by Jesus. Here we go again. Jesus appears to Paul and encourages him. The following night, after that event happened in the Sanhedrin, the Lord stood by Paul and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." All right, so what he's saying here is, like, you're not going to die here in Jerusalem because I want you to testify of me in the city of Rome. So you're going to get to Rome. Now, you see the word Jerusalem and see the word Rome, and it's really interesting because Jerusalem is really the headquarters for the Old Covenant, whereas Rome is the headquarters of the New Covenant. And there's a transition taking place, and it takes place in the book of Acts and after the book of Acts, where basically the focus of God and God's people goes from Jerusalem to Rome. And there's a number of things in scripture and in history that show that transition taking place. And so Jesus has said to Paul, "Yeah, you've testified of me here in Jerusalem several times, but you're going to be transitioned to Rome and to do it there." And again, you see this divine presence with Paul, Jesus showing up and speaking to him, coaching him, encouraging him, all of this stuff. So he was doing miracles and he was being talked to by Jesus. So you have this divine presence. We know Peter had this going on too. We can assume that the other apostles had something like this happening as they are out in the world ministering. And so you see divine presence with the apostles, and that's just a signal to all of us that we are to listen to the apostles. We are the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We're built on the foundation of the apostles. That's Ephesians chapter 2. Jesus gave a body of truth to the apostles. The apostles gave it to the church. And the church and its leadership especially is to guard that, promote it, defend it, and hand it off to the next generation. That's what we're called to do until Jesus comes back. It's pretty simple, right? It's not rocket science. I mean, this is what we're here to do. And so we get all kind of caught up in a lot of other things and this main thing gets lost. St. Paul discovers a Jewish plot to kill him. Paul discovers Jewish plans to ambush him and kill him, but the Romans protect him from this. All right, so we're told in Acts that more than 40 Jews got together and swore an oath that they would not eat or drink anything until they had killed Paul. And they plot this whole deal with the chief priest and the elders of Jerusalem. They're in on it. They're in on it to kill Paul. And so the job of the chief priests and the elders of Jerusalem is to talk to the Romans and to tell the commander especially, they are to say, "Hey, commander, can you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow? Because we just want to question him a little bit more. Everything will be fine. Can you bring him down there?" And if that happened, that these guys, these 40 guys, were going to be hiding on the way, and they were going to jump out and kill Paul. Now, this seems to imply that they would have had to have taken the Romans out too, right? I mean, the Romans aren't just going to stand there. They're going to protect Paul, and there's going to be a fight. And so that would have caused a huge mess for Israel if that happened. Because when a rebellion does start in the 60s, the 80s, 60s, it turns into a war against the Romans, and the Romans wind up destroying all of Israel, destroying the entire city of Jerusalem, and flattening the temple. And so they're kind of risking this right now. It's like world powers today risking nuclear war, right? I mean, that's the most insane thing you could ever hear is people flirting with that at any level. Because it's not, oh, that's over there. If the nuclear bombs go off, they go over there. Yeah. And then the crap goes into the atmosphere and covers the globe, right? And then we get to kind of consume that wherever you are, because those things are something. And so that's what they were flirting with disaster here. But this was their plan. And the religious leaders of Jerusalem were in on this. Now, somehow, Paul's sister's son, Paul's nephew, he discovers the plot and informs Paul, and then he informs the Roman commander. And so good old Claudius Lysias, he says, oh, okay. And he organizes 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to take Paul out of Jerusalem. And they're going to do it at the third hour of the night. Now, in Roman time telling, this is 3 hours after sunset. That's the third hour of the night. And so they're going to go under the cover of darkness, and they're going to get him out of there, and they're going to transfer Paul up to Caesarea. And Caesarea is the seat of the Roman governor for that region. And so they're getting him up to the Roman governor. And there's the track that they take from Jerusalem up to Caesarea, because in the book of Acts, they talk about the stops that they made, so we know the exact way that they went. It's fascinating to see the Roman military actually taking care of Paul here and guarding him, keeping him safe. St. Paul transferred to the Roman governor at Caesarea. The Roman military escorts Paul to Caesarea, where he's handed over to the Roman governor, and his name is Felix. This was a common name and a good name in the first century for the Romans, and he's now the governor of this region. So the military escort taking Paul to Caesarea, they also have a letter from Claudius Lysias explaining why this guy Paul is being brought to the governor. And so he gets there, and the Roman governor Felix receives Paul. Paul talks to him a little bit. Paul starts to get, religious with him. And this Roman governor says, hold on, I'll hear more about this when your accusers come up. So he says, we're just going to keep you up here. We're going to have the religious rulers of Jerusalem come up, and then we're going to have a little trial. And so Paul is placed under house arrest in Herod's Praetorium. But they give him lots of liberty. While he's under house arrest, anybody that wants to come see him can come see him. His friends, there's a church there, Philip's there, remember, and he's very close to the Christians up there, Paul is, and anybody who wants to come visit, they can do that. So they're showing him great kindness and giving him a lot of liberty. Now, I want to, just a comparison, there's contrast as well, but between Jesus and Paul's experiences, there's a great comparison, because what was Jesus doing in his ministry? He was preaching and working miracles. And there were conversions. People were becoming followers of Christ. But then he was attacked by unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem, Jesus was. And then he appeared before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And then he was taken to his death. Now, that's pretty much the same pattern that St. Paul is on right now. This is what he's been doing in his ministry, preaching Christ and working miracles. And there were tremendous conversions around the Roman Empire because of Paul. But then he's attacked by unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem. We just saw that happen. And now he's appearing before the Roman governor, Felix. And from here, he's going to be taken to Rome, to his martyrdom, to his death. All right, so he's up at Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea. And I'm showing you the ruins of Caesarea Maritima. I know a number of you have been to this site. And here's what you're looking at, ruins of Caesarea Maritima. In blue there, you see the Roman aqueducts that brought water into the city, fresh water into the city, and there's still some that you can go see. And it had an amazing harbor there in red. It had a hippodrome there in yellow for a number of things, including chariot races. And then purple, you see the theater. And then in white, that's the Praetorium. That's where Paul was under house arrest, in that location right there on the Mediterranean. I mean, if you got to be under house arrest, it's not such a bad place to be under house arrest, right? but he had no idea what was coming next. St. Paul on trial in Caesarea. So Paul is tried before Felix at Caesarea. The Jews are there, and they are the prosecutors, and Paul provides his own defense. So the high priest is up there, and the elders of Jerusalem, they are with him, and they all arrive in Caesarea to see Paul tried. And they're hoping that they can get Paul because they really want to. It's all that's on their mind. An expert orator named Tertullus delivers the prosecution's case against Paul. And these are some of the things that he said. And he's speaking to Felix because Felix is the judge. We have found this man a plague. This man, Paul, he's a plague. He's a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, if you're Felix, you're like, what? But he hears all that. Okay, very nice. And then this Tertullus guy keeps going. And he says, we wanted to judge him according to our law. Yeah. But the commander, Lysias, came by and with great violence took him out of our hands. So he slights Lysias here. They don't like Lysias because Lysias protected Paul and got Paul out of Jerusalem, and they wanted to kill Paul. So they don't like that man too much. So he kind of takes a jab at Lysias. So Felix listens to all this, and then it's Paul's turn, and he stands up and he presents his defense. And he says, he's talking to Felix, I confess to you that according to the way, and remember, that's what the Christians were called, and Paul uses that word a lot for the church. According to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. So he's saying that they're calling this a sect of Judaism. I call it the fulfillment of Judaism. And I can go through the prophets and I can go through the Mosaic law and I can show you how this all pointed to Christ. And it was all there to prepare us to receive Christ and bow to him. I can show you all this because Paul did that all the time with people. And he says, so I actually believe the law and the prophets. These guys don't. We're not a sect. We're the fulfillment of what was going on in the Old Testament. This is what he says. And then he says, I have hope in God that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Now that's taken right out of the book of Daniel, chapter 12, when Gabriel is speaking to Daniel. And he says, here's what's going to happen, Daniel, at the very end times. He says there's going to be a resurrection and everybody's going to be raised, some to condemnation and some will be raised to everlasting life. So that's what Daniel heard that 500 years before Christ came from the angel Gabriel. And so this is what Paul is saying. He's saying the same thing. There's going to be a resurrection of the dead, just like Daniel said, because he said, if we're going to go through the prophets, I'll talk about that, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. And we already know what Paul means by that because he's talked about it before. He's like, I want my conscience clean when I go to bed at night. And my conscience is clean when I know that I've told everybody the truth about the judgment that is to come and how to get ready for it. That's what he means by that. He's not talking about, oh, I just want to be a nice person, right? I want to be a Boy Scout kind of a guy. That's another gospel. He was saying that I'm clean of the blood of all men. That's how he put it before, because I tell them the truth. I tell them that their house is on fire, and I tell them to get out. So I tell them that they're sinful in the sight of God, and they're going to be judged one day. And if they want to prepare for that and be saved from God's wrath, then they have to come to Christ. They have to receive Christ and have the blood of Christ cleanse them of their sin. And so he says, my conscience is clean because I tell everybody this, and he does. All right, so Felix declares, he goes, you know what? When Lysias comes down, I'll make a decision on your case. So if you notice, he just keeps putting it off. He doesn't know what to do here. Because when Paul first got there, he says, I'm going to wait for your accusers to come. Then we'll take care of it. Well, the accusers have come. And they've gone through a trial, and now he says, you know what, I'm going to wait for Claudius to come up here before I make a decision. He keeps putting it off, and he puts it off for a long time. In fact, he never deals with it. And then he leaves, and somebody else comes in. Felix sets a centurion over Paul, and Paul is allowed to have liberty and have any friends come visit. Felix and his wife, Drusilla, quite a name, who is Jewish, they have Paul speak to them often about Christ. So you got this Roman governor who's married to a Jewish woman, and both of them are kind of very interested in Paul's message. And so they have Paul come and kind of talk with them. They have discussions with Paul. And we're told in the book of Acts that Paul speaks to them about righteousness and self control and the judgment to come. See, Paul always talks about that. So, anybody in the tradition of the apostles is always going to be telling the world about a judgment that is to come, and you need to get ready for it. And here's how: you bend the knee to Jesus alone. And so, this is what Paul says. Now, Felix is very interested in Paul's message, but it scares him. And there are times where Felix is like, "Oh, I've heard enough. We'll talk later. Goodbye, Paul." Right when Paul talks about the judgment, that's when he wants to kind of get out of the room. And that does frighten people. But it's not like the church has a message, judgment is coming. Sorry, it doesn't end there, because that would be scary. It's judgment is coming. Oh, I'm scared. Well, there's a remedy for it. Right? There's a way you can be saved from the wrath to come. And that's the way Paul put it. He said, be saved from the wrath to come. So Drusilla, like I said, she's the Jewish wife of the Roman governor Felix, and she is a daughter of Herod Agrippa I, and she is the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one who received the wise men. He's the one who tried to have Jesus killed as a baby, which caused Joseph to take Mary and Jesus to Egypt. That was Herod the Great. He's the one who built the temple, reconstructed the temple in Jerusalem that's in use at this time. And so she's the great granddaughter of Herod the Great, and she's the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. Now, Herod Agrippa I is in the book of Acts. He executed James, who was one of the 12 disciples. And he was the brother of John, the Apostle John, who writes the Gospel of John. It's James and John. They're brothers. And he executed James. And he also imprisoned Peter. But that's when the angel came at night and got Peter out of prison. And then he executed the guards for letting Peter go. Even though they didn't let him go, the angel came and got him out. But all that happened. That was Agrippa I. That is Drusilla's dad. Agrippa I was the guy who was struck down by an angel of the Lord here in this very city, Caesarea. He's the guy who got up and made a speech, and there was all these people, and they all started saying, "The voice of a God and not a man." And he was like, "Yeah, baby." He took the praise. And then we're told in the book of Acts, an angel struck him, and 3 days later he died. He was eaten by worms, it ends the passage in Acts. So that's that Agrippa. And Drusilla is his daughter. And she's married to the governor now, and she's listening to the Apostle Paul, and she heard a lot of what the Apostle Paul had to say. So there's the family tree of Herod the Great, and there you see Drusilla, and she's married to Felix, the governor. All right, if you also see there, Agrippa II is Drusilla's brother, and a girl named Bernice is Drusilla's sister. All right, Festus replaces Felix, and St. Paul appeals to Caesar. And this is AD 59, somewhere around there. So Paul is under house arrest for 2 years. He's living in that location under house arrest for 2 years. After this, Festus replaces Felix as the Roman governor of the region. Now, immediately, basically on his first day as governor, he goes down to the main city that he governs, which is Jerusalem, and the Jews talk to him immediately about Paul. It's been 2 years, and they're still thinking about Paul, and they still want to get the Apostle Paul. And so they talk to him, and they say, "Can you send him down to Jerusalem?" And they had a plan, we're told in the book of Acts, to ambush him on the way to Jerusalem and kill him before he even gets into the city. So they still are passionate about taking out Paul. Well, Festus says, "You know what? I think we'll do this. You could gather some of your rulers, and they can go. I'm going up to Caesarea, tomorrow. They can go up with me, and we'll have a little trial up there." And so the Jews are like, and so they do it, though. All right, so now we have another trial up at Caesarea. This is 2 years after the first one. Festus, the new governor, is seated on the judgment seat, and the Jews of Jerusalem are the prosecutors, and Paul provides again his own defense. Now, Festus asked Paul So they have the trial, and you can read about. There's so much I'm not covering. Very interesting details in the book of Acts. If you read these chapters 21 through 28, there's so much going on, and it's a lot of fun. It's very interesting. And so they have their little trial back and forth. Paul does what he normally does. He uses it to defend himself, but more than that, to preach Christ, and all that goes on. And then at the end of that, Festus says to Paul, would you be willing to go down to Jerusalem with these guys to be tried down there? And Paul, he doesn't say it this way in the book of Acts, but he says, I think I like it better here, because he knows what that means. If he goes with the Jews, he's a dead man. And he says, no. But he feels like Festus is leaning that way of sending Paul. He's kind of reading the room, and he goes, this guy's going to send me down there. So he cries out, I appeal to Caesar. And that's something a Roman citizen could do anywhere in the Roman Empire. If they felt like they were not getting a just trial, and you were a citizen, an official citizen of the Roman Empire, you could cry out, I appeal to Caesar. And this means you're going to be sent to Rome, and Rome's going to deal with it. And that's a right that you have. And all the governors, all the procurators, all throughout the Roman Empire had to do that. If somebody appealed to Caesar and they were a citizen, they had to send them to Rome. And so Paul lets it rip. He plays that card. And so Festus responds, oh, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. Who's the Caesar at that time? Nero. But Nero was just getting started. He got real crazy in the 60s. A lot of people did, didn't they? I said that. I'm like, yeah, that applies. You can say that about the United States. Got a little crazy in the 60s. The whole country went a little crazy in the 60s in many ways. St. Paul before King Agrippa. St. Paul presents the case for Christ before Agrippa and his sister Bernice. And also Festus and prominent men of Caesarea are there. King Agrippa, he comes into town and he's heard about Paul and he wants to hear Paul talk, because everybody's talking about Paul. And so they have a time where Agrippa and his sister Bernice and Festus the governor and prominent men of Caesarea, they go into an auditorium and then they bring Paul in and basically say, talk. He wants to hear you. So King Agrippa and his sister Bernice come to Caesarea. They come to greet Festus. He's the new governor. King Agrippa rules part of Judea and some other places. He wants to go talk to his neighboring ruler, get to know him, but I think he probably knows him already. And this is interesting because King Agrippa and his sister Bernice, their sister was Drusilla, the wife of Felix, who's now gone because Felix has been transferred to another location. Agrippa is commonly known as Herod Agrippa II, and he was the son of Herod Agrippa I, the guy who killed James, put Peter into prison, and died in Caesarea in the theater. And so all three of the kiddos have now been in Caesarea because Drusilla was there, and now Bernice and Herod Agrippa II are all here in the city where their dad died. And they're all great-grandchildren of Herod the Great. And Herod the Great had a number of wives, and he had a Jewish wife. And they descend from Herod and his Jewish wife. So there's Bernice. I had Drusilla circled. Now there's Bernice. So these are siblings, Agrippa II, Drusilla, and Bernice. And they're all great-grandchildren of Herod the Great. All right, St. Paul before King Agrippa. St. Paul presents the case for Christ before Agrippa. Any audience he has, he doesn't care who it is, what level in society that you are at. He's going to talk to you about Christ because he has seen things. He's seen Jesus a number of times. He saw the third heaven. All the pomp and circumstance of the king coming in with Bernice, which the Bible says there was a lot as they came into the room and everything. It doesn't mean anything to Paul because he has seen greater things. And so Paul speaks and he talks about his Jewish background. He always brings that up. He goes, I was a passionate Jew, and I was so passionate I persecuted the church that I now serve. I persecuted the Christ that I now serve. And then I had my conversion. He talks about his conversion. And then Christ gave me this calling. He says, here's what I preach everywhere, and I'm preaching it to you, that all should repent and turn to God through Christ the Messiah to prepare for the resurrection of the dead and divine judgment. He puts that in all the time because that's what gets the room kicking. You can just talk religious and lovey-dovey and all this, but when you start talking about judgment, everybody listens up. And Paul drops that in every time because it's true. It's not like just a little ploy to get people interested in what he's saying. He's like, this is true. The house is on fire. And so you've got to hear me, get out. And that's the way he looked at it. So Paul, we have the cliff notes in the book of Acts, but who knows how long he went on for. And then finally, Festus, the governor, who's a Gentile, he says with a very loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. He's like, what is all this stuff? He's not a Jew, so all of this is like going over his head. What is this? He goes, you seem like a sharp guy, but you're so smart, but I think you're too smart. You're going crazy. But Agrippa, who is a Jew, said to Paul, Paul, I have to tell you, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. After listening to that, I'm that close. And then Paul says to Agrippa, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today, everybody in the room, might become such as I am, a Christian, except for these chains. These chains. He goes, I wish all of you were just like me, except for these chains. St. Paul is taken from Caesarea to Rome. Luke provides an incredible account of Paul's voyage to Rome. It is so detailed. Luke is on the ship with Paul going to Rome, and he details everything. And a lot happened on this voyage to Rome, big time voyage to Italy. And then they walk up to Rome. And it's quite exciting. And I think you guys should read it. It won't take you long, Acts 21 through 28, and especially this section that deals with this voyage to Rome. So there's a Roman centurion, and his name is Julius. He's given charge over Paul and another group of prisoners to go and take them to Rome. So Paul's going to Rome. This other group of prisoners going to Rome too. There's this Roman centurion. There's other guards too with him, but he's in charge. He's the one who is responsible for getting those guys to Rome. And so they board a ship there at Caesarea, and we are told in the book of Acts that Julius is very kind to Paul. So here we have another Roman being very kind to Paul. Luke and Aristarchus was a convert from Thessalonica, from Paul's ministry there in Thessalonica. He's there with Paul, and Luke is there with Paul, and they travel with Paul. After a stop at Sidon, which is just up the coast in Lebanon today, they continue along the coast of Asia Minor, and they go to Myra, where they board a larger grain ship that had come from Alexandria that is going to Italy. So they go to Myra, they get on another ship, a big ship, and that ship is supposed to take them to Italy. All right, so they're traveling, they're on the sea, facing contrary winds. The winds are really picking up. They struggle to reach fair havens on the island of Crete, on the southern shores of Crete. They had a hard time getting there. Now, when they're there, Paul advises the men running the ship and the men in charge and the centurion that he's with, I think we ought to stay here for the winter. We made it in here, just barely made it in here. We should stay here for the winter. But they said, no, we're going to try to make it over to Phoenix, which is another harbor on the island of Crete, and we're going to try to get there. Well, they set off, and a violent storm comes in, a nor'easter, and it drives the ship off course for 14 days. They're out at sea in stormy seas for 14 days. And it got so bad that they were throwing the cargo overboard. And they were all panicking, and everybody thought they were going to die. So the red line is the track that they take, the voyage, where they leave Caesarea, one stop at Sidon, and then they go to Myra. And when they get to Myra, there's a ship that has come up from Egypt that's making its way to Italy, bringing grain. And they get on that ship, and it's a big ship. And then the fun happens. They start sailing, they make it to fair havens there on Crete. And then they say, okay, we're going to go over to Phoenix, but they never make it to Phoenix because they're blown out into the Mediterranean Sea, and 14 days in a storm on this ship. All right, so here's Paul in Acts 27. He says, men, you should have listened to me. And I think Paul's going to say that to a lot of people one day. You know what? You should have listened to me. And you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and all this loss. We had to throw everything overboard. And now I urge you to take heart. He says, all right, you should have listened to me, but I got some good news. Take heart, because there's going to be no loss of life among you, only the ship. Now, that's something to hear. You're on a ship out in the Mediterranean in storms, and Paul says, we're all going to survive, but the ship isn't. And you're like, how's that going to work, right? We're on the ship. But that's what he says. And I know this because there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. And this angel said to me, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar." In other words, you're going to get to Rome. So don't worry, you're not going down with the ship here in the Mediterranean. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So when you read that, what is that telling you? Paul's been praying to God for his safety, but also for all the men on the ship. He's praying for all the men on the ship. And the angel is saying, God's going to grant you that request that you've been praying for. And so Paul says, that's what the angel told me. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. He says, we're all going to be saved, but it's not going to be easy. And we're actually going to run aground on a certain island. All right, shipwrecked on Malta. And this is around AD 60. Paul's words are fulfilled, and their ship runs aground on a certain island, and it's Malta. All right, so they sense land, the sailors do, and they see it then, and they say, we're going for it. The storm is still raging. And so they're doing everything they can to get to this island of Malta, and they're coming up, getting closer to the shore, but offshore, the ship gets stuck in a sandbar, and the waves are hitting it, and the wind is rough, and the ship begins to fall apart. Acts 27:42 through 44. And the soldiers, it was their plan to kill the prisoners. If you're transporting prisoners and they get away, the Roman government doesn't care how they got away. They're not going to say, oh, you had a little storm. We're sorry. We'll let you off the hook. You lost the prisoners, because they were afraid that the prisoners were going to swim up the shore and get away. And then they would die. The soldiers were. So the soldiers were going to kill the prisoners lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, he kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, which were all over the place now, kind of grab one of those and paddle ashore, kick, right? If you can swim, jump in and get to shore if you can. The rest of you just grab some wood and start kicking like a little kid. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. There were 276 men on this ship, and every one of them survived. And Paul said that was going to happen. So that would have gotten the attention of people that heard Paul say that. It's like, that's exactly what happened. And we ran aground on the island, just like you said. And it said in the book of Acts that they were shown, all the men who came ashore, they were shown unusual kindness by the natives of Malta. Paul survives a viper bite. He's bit by a snake on Malta. He's putting wood on a fire, and they're just starting the fire, and there's a snake that was down underneath there, and it bit the Apostle Paul. And all the natives said, "Uh-oh," because they knew what kind of snake it was. And they said, well, he's going to die very soon from that snake. And then they started saying, he must be a bad guy because the gods are getting him. You know, he must have done something really bad for that to happen to him. And then Paul shook it off into the fire. Basically said, go to hell. He just right into the fire, and there it went. And then they kept watching him, and he's fine. He's fine. Nothing happens to him. So then they said, oh, he's not a bad guy. He's a really good guy. In fact, he's a god. And they started to say, you're a god. And he had to defend that off. He's like, come on, guys. But now everybody's focused on the island of Malta. Everybody's focused on Paul. And we're told that he does many miracles on Malta while he's there. He's there for 3 months. He heals a bunch of people, including the father of the chief of the island. And so now you have a Christian presence in Malta. And since this time, there's been a Christian presence on Malta. So God kind of blew Paul ashore there to evangelize the island, which occurs. It's really cool. He's there for 3 months. They spend the winter there. St. Paul arrives in Rome about AD 60. Paul, under house arrest in Rome, strengthens the church and also presents the gospel of Christ to the Jewish leaders of the city. All right, Paul and company winter at Malta for 3 months, and then they board another Alexandrian grain ship, which was going to Italy. It had also wintered at the island because of the storm. They sailed to Syracuse in Sicily first, and then they went on to Italy, and they land at Puteoli. Paul travels by land to Rome and is welcomed by believers along the way. Okay, so here you go. You see Malta. and then they leave Malta and they go up to Sicily to Syracuse, and they're there for a while, and then they go all the way up to Puteoli. They go to Puteoli, and I kind of zoom on the right to what's going on. This location as they're getting closer to coming ashore in Italy, and they land at Puteoli. Now, so this is interesting because we're in 60 AD, and they sail right past Mount Vesuvius, which erupts like crazy in 79 AD. So this is like 19 years before that great eruption that we still talk about today. And they go by Pompeii and everything and go to Puteoli, and then they get off the ship and they're going to walk the rest of the way to Rome. All right, Paul gets on the Appian Way, which is a Roman road, very famous one. We came to Puteoli. This is Luke writing, where we found brethren. So there were Christians in Puteoli. You can see how the church is just, even in Paul's lifetime, the church is spread throughout the Roman Empire. There are Christians and churches everywhere at this time. It's really interesting. There's one at Puteoli. And so we found brethren, and they invited us to stay with them for 7 days. And then after that, we went toward Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they heard we were coming to Rome, they came out to meet us. Lots of Christians were coming south to meet Paul as he was going north, coming toward Rome, northwest, I guess. And he says a group of them met us at the Forum of Appius, and then some more met us at the Three Taverns. Sounds like a cool place. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. So Acts 28:16, now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So everybody else is just handed off as a group, but they take Paul and say, you know what, you can live in your own house, and we're going to have a soldier living there with you, just to keep watch over you, but total freedom. Anybody can come see you. You're good. And so Paul rents a house. We're told that in a second. So it would have been something to see Rome in the first century. And Paul is now seeing it probably for the first time. In Rome, Paul lives under house arrest for 2 years. The Jewish leadership of Rome, they come and they meet. These are not Christian Jews. These are the synagogue Jews of Rome. They come and they meet with Paul, and most of them are very reasonable people. And they come and they meet and they sit with him like for an entire day. And he explains from the Hebrew scriptures, Christ, and they listen. And some of them convert to Christ because of that. Others say, I want to hear more about it. He explains the faith to anyone who visits his house, and many would have been coming. Christians from the church at Rome came to see him all the time. I would have, you would have. And also visitors to the city of Rome, Christians from other places that come to Rome. They're like, I hear Paul's here and I can go see him. Yeah, you can. Doors wide open. And they would have been doing the same thing. And then people that were just curious, who's this Paul guy I hear so much about? I think I'm going to go listen to him just to see, what he's talking about. So Paul has this constant flow of visitors, and his house becomes like the Hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus. Remember, he was there for 2 years teaching every day. Now he's doing that in Rome from this rented house that he has. And so that's how the book of Acts concludes, by saying that. Acts 28:30. Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no one forbidding him. St. Paul is eventually freed by the Romans. They didn't have much of a case. Even the Romans are like, why is this guy on trial, right? The Jews are the ones that are really passionate by that. So he gets freed by the Romans. He travels to Spain, and eventually he returns back to Rome, where he's eventually arrested in Rome and then executed under Emperor Nero. When Nero's really kicking in the persecution after the Great Fire of Rome, this is when Paul goes down, and this is when Peter goes down as well. All right, so the early Christians and church fathers state that Paul, he left Rome the first time, that we just talked about, and that he went to Spain. A number of the church fathers say he went to Spain, he shared the gospel in Spain, then he came back to Rome, and when he got back, at some point he was arrested, and then he was beheaded under Emperor Nero. Peter was crucified, tradition says upside down. He wasn't a Roman citizen. If you're going to be executed, that's how they did it. They executed you by crucifying. If you were a Roman citizen, there are privileges, and you don't get crucified. You get beheaded if you're going to be executed. So that's why St. Paul was beheaded, and that's why Peter was crucified, because Peter was not a Roman citizen and Paul was. Okay, so final words of St. Paul. We find these in 2 Timothy 4:11. This is on his second visit to Rome when he's arrested and he eventually dies on this visit to Rome. And he writes to Timothy and he says, "Only Luke is with me." Everybody, he had some other people with him. They took off. They were scared because Paul was under the sentence of death and he was in a real prison at this point. It's not house arrest. And the Romans would see that if anybody came to visit Paul, oh, you're with him? Do you believe the same things he believes? So people weren't coming to visit. But Luke never left his side. And then he writes in 2 Timothy 4 to Timothy, he says, "I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand." He knew he was going to be put to death any day. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." So he can say that. And he says, "Finally, there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Now, when Christ appears, the only people who are going to love that are those who are prepared for it, those who already love Jesus. And it's like, oh, I get to see you finally, kind of a deal. And we're going to love that. And plus, if you are a Christian, you're disturbed by the evil in the world, the injustice, the true injustice in the world, all that sort of thing. Christ comes back, he makes all that right. And he gets rid of all the darkness, all the injustice, the devil, everybody, everything's gone, right? So you're very happy to see him. And you're going to spend eternity with him. You're very happy to see him. And Paul says, "I'm receiving a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, is going to give to me on judgment day. And he's going to give it to everybody who loves to see Jesus." This is what he said. So those are pretty much his last words, the last things that we have from the Apostle Paul. And what a way to go out to say something like that. St. Paul was martyred, like I said, during Nero's persecution. His body was buried in a Christian cemetery owned by a lady called Lucina, a devoted Christian woman, and that's where he was buried. And a church was built there in the 300s, and that was there for a long time. And then this church that's there now was built later. The Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls marks the location of his grave, which is situated outside the ancient city walls of Rome. So in the first century, this was outside the walls where he was buried. Okay, so that's interesting. So you go into the church, and the main altar there, Paul's tomb is under the altar. St. Paul outside the walls.